Welcome to the Ironcenturion Podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. I'm Michael.
And they call me Tim. So if you're hanging out with us for one of the first times, welcome. As Michael mentioned, this podcast is about leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. And those are some things that are near and dear to our hearts as we lead this ministry of men that are drawing near to the heart of Christ, but also to the hearts of one another. Michael and I, we've been friends for well over a decade now at this point. We've had some good times. We've had some fun adventures. And this is just a cool place where we get to voice some of those things that we've learned, talk through some things that we've been challenged by recently. And one of the things, before we get started in today's episode that I want to talk about, Michael, is there's this burning question in my mind of when is it okay to start this process of having an annual guys trip, right? Like you hear about these guys that have I've been fishing with my buddies for the last umpteen years in Alaska, and we do this every year as a guys thing, right? So we're both in our mid 30s at this point, and I feel like now is kind of the time for that, right?
I do wonder. I was talking with somebody recently who's kind of a soon to retire pastor. And he mentioned that he's been doing a pastor retreat, which I guess you could say it's kind of a work-related thing, but it's a pastor retreat with the same 4 or 5 pastors. I think he said they did it for 25 straight years so far, and no one has missed. They've never missed. They've never canceled one. They've never missed one, and no one's ever been absent.
So clearly, they're not millennials.
They clearly do have a good grasp of commitment and calendaring. But yeah, they've been doing it for a long time. And so that is a good question. How did those things get started? Are they are you supposed to do it at a certain time? How does that happen? I've been personally taking a semi-annual or annual. What's the right word?
You can't even commit to being by yourself.
Right. So I say it's annual, but in reality, it's every other year pretty much. And I go up to Colorado and take my Jeep. But it hasn't happened every year. But I've now been doing that 6 or 7 years, every other year.
Most of the time.
on good years that it's not raining, or I don't know, whatever the excuse is.
So we're planning a trip, right? So this is our first staff trip here that we've got on the books, sort of. We're still in the planning phases of that. But the goal is to get at least most of our Ironcenturion staff guys out to a place in the mountains somewhere for a couple of days that we can just spend some time together and do manly things.
Yeah. It seems like a good time to start doing that kind of thing, to deepen relationships and spend time in a new context, outside of your normal 9-to-5 context, in a disconnected space. And for me, the mountains call to my soul in a very powerful way. So it's a meaningful thing for me.
Yeah. And I just see we've talked about, that definition of faithfulness being long-term obedience in the same direction, right? This idea that you have this almost compounding interest effect of time and discipline when that's in play. And I think a men's trip can definitely be something like that, where if you see yourself in 20, 30 years having taken this trip with these guys 20 or 30 times, I think there's a lot of great things that can be dividends for that. So if you're a guy that's maybe a little bit farther down the road than us on this, has figured out how to do this, when to do this, and how to make it a consistent thing, we would love to hear your feedback. Email us at podcast@ironcenturion.org.
Yeah, tell us how yours started. If it's a fishing trip to Alaska, though, I suspect it's because somebody in your group owns a plane. That's how it has to happen, right? That's how Alaska happens, right? If somebody owns a plane.
I don't know, maybe. I mean, they fly commercially up to Alaska, I think.
Well, yes. Yeah. Everybody I know that's doing a fishing trip to Alaska thing, it's because they always said, well, one of my buddies has a plane and he just takes us all up there. That's how everybody who does that one, that's how I've heard that happens.
Step 1, find a buddy with a plane.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's my question for the day. But Michael, why don't you kind of talk us into what are we talking about on the podcast today?
Well, I think that really fits what we're talking about, because what I wanted to discuss with you is this idea of, I wanted to get your thoughts on the idea of trust. What is trust? How does it work? How does it work in today's culture. And one of the things I've noticed from men who are further down the path in life, they have a cohort of men, maybe those they've been taking those kind of regular trips with, that they have a really profound, deep trust built up. And so I just wanted to talk about trust, unpack trust, what's good about it, what's bad about it, how does it work, what are some of the pitfalls, and pick your brain a little bit about that idea.
Okay, sounds good.
I think I've noticed something, and I'd be curious if you agree or disagree. I think I have noticed over the last decade, maybe 15 years or so, 20 years, and a general erosion of trust in our culture, meaning that people trust slower, or they need more convincing, or trust is easier to break. Maybe they're just more cynical. But I've noticed that trust seems to have delays or in developing that it didn't have 20 years ago. And I don't know, maybe that's just a life stage. Maybe that's normal for this life stage, but I'm concerned that it's not. I'm concerned it's part of culture. Have you seen that too?
Yeah, I would say definitely I've seen that, but I almost wonder if my experience is tainted a little bit by my experience with the military. Because there's like a subculture within the military that surrounds trust. As you can imagine, that's a very important aspect of things in that line of work. And I've talked about this with guys in all branches, and it's kind of a common thing that I've experienced, that it's not just like unique here and there, but this is like common everywhere in the military. And that is like, if you are the new guy, you are not trusted until you prove yourself. And that, so it's the cold shoulder treatment. It's you get the grunt work until you prove yourself otherwise, or another new guy shows up. I mean, that kind of mindset and mentality.
Yeah.
But I think that's a completely different reasoning for why that. I don't think it's talking about culture as a whole.
Yeah. But then would you say, though, on the flip side of that culture, of that coin, then once you're in the kind of the circle of trust, it's pretty sticky within military circles?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
This reminded me of the episode when Levi was on. I think it was episode 7, and he talked about some of the stuff for being a veteran, and he talked about some of the relationships and connections with others. And I remember him talking a little bit about the trust connection community. That's interesting. I hadn't even thought about that. Wow, I hadn't thought about that for you being part of the equation.
So there's that curveball. Where were you thinking it would go, though?
Well, I was just, I have noticed that. So in my profession, what I do professionally, for example, I build trust with people. It's a trust related work and business that I'm in, working directly with lots of different individuals as a consultant. And so I've discovered that over the last 15, 20 years, gaining trust, keeping it, has become increasingly challenging. And I've also wondered if that is true in other places of society. I see like it is like we used to trust reviews online all the time, right? You want to buy a product, you go and read the reviews. But now we know that there's a handful of those reviews that are fraudulent, because the sellers know that the reviews matter. And so they are working to manipulate those, right? And so I've seen products that are sold, for example, online, that they build a great reputation, and then someone will come in and buy that product, or even the people who already owned it, they will cut the quality of the product drastically, but they'll continue to coast on the reputation the product had. And so they've now drastically reduced the quality of the product, but it had great reviews before. So now they're making much more margin because they can charge the same price, but they've lowered the cost of making it. And so this whole website is dedicated to help you find this. Like there's like fake review spotting websites.
I usually go for the broken English, like, great product, always buy again.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, I really probably don't need to buy 3 of these, but thanks.
Exactly. So there's like, I did this the other day. I was buying something I've never experienced before. And I put the link to the store into the fake review spotting website. And it said, yeah, we give this a grade of C, meaning there's a number of fraudulent reviews. I don't know what algorithms they use to tell, but they're like, some of these reviews are manipulated. I don't know how they know that, but manipulated. And so you probably shouldn't trust them. So now I've transferred my trust from the online store that was collecting the reviews. I've now transferred my trust to this review analysis website. And it's just interesting how trust is moving or breaking in the things we spend our money on and how we buy stuff.
So do you think that's a person-to-person trust that's been broken? Like we as humans are skeptical of one another?
That's what I'm concerned with. I'm concerned that there's a growing skepticism or cynicalness between people that maybe online is helping fuel that. I don't know where it's coming from, but I am concerned that it will have damages in people's ability to build meaningful friendships. Building and making friends is hard. It's already hard. And so if we're moving in a lower trust environment, that concerns me. Like how then are you to make friends if it's harder to trust people?
I remember 10, 15 years ago when people thought social media was going to be the greatest thing. It would keep us connected to all these people. And I think, the sham is definitely up on that one. And it's completely the opposite. I think it negatively has impacts on trust of other people. I just sold something on eBay the other day, and was working with the buyer to arrange pickup terms and all those things. And it's just like there's this underlying like skepticism of this person is trying to sham me. They're trying to like pull a fast one on me. At the end of the day, it was just another nice guy who just wanted to buy what I had and come pick it up at my garage. Like,
yeah. And I see it in a lot of places too, like that I think that if you were just to sit down at the table with that person, you would find tremendous common ground in the shared human experience. You'd agree on a lot of things. But then outside of that, in the anonymity of the internet or in the voting booth politically, or in the talking about news or media, like you're just at each other's throats. And you're like, this person is completely terrible and they're just absurd. But then in reality, at the core, we all kind of want a lot of the same things, and we're all pretty mellow about many of those things. The super scary bad guy doesn't really exist all the time in the way that we're being told that it does, like that everybody's scary. Crime rates have been falling in the US as a trend for a very long time, and yet we're continually told that it's scary, but the crime rates are coming down and have been. And so we're told, stranger danger. I sometimes wonder, and I can say this naively because I don't have any kids, but I wonder if it's good to teach our kids stranger danger, because just because someone's a stranger doesn't mean they wish you harm. There are bad people, yes, but not all strangers are bad. And sometimes if you're a kid that's lost, it seems to me like a stranger might be the solution, right?
Yeah, we've had conversations with our kids about those, and it's mainly looking at behaviors, right? Helping them identify behaviors that are not right. Which, as a child, when you don't have that, database of previous experiences, right? Like you need people to help feed you, like this is okay and this is not okay. And we've outlined parameters of like, if an adult tries to do this with you, like this is not okay. And really, rather than saying all strangers are bad, which I agree is probably not the best choice. But I mean, from a very simplistic point of view, I think there definitely is a maturing that happens, and that's a kid to kid type of decision too. Of do you have a kid that's incredibly naive and very trusting of everyone? And that's usually most younger children, right? And maybe you tailor that advice differently for them than you would your child that's 4 to 5 years older.
Sure. But I also just wonder what it's meant for people growing up in that stranger danger idea mentality. And I'm sure there's studies on this. I didn't look at any of that, but I mean, I just remember like somebody used to knock on the door or ring the doorbell, and that was an exciting moment, right? Run to the door, see who's here. This is fantastic. And now I find myself, and maybe this is just me, but I find myself like the doorbell rings and it's like, duck and hide, make it look like nobody's here, peek around the corner and see who's at the door, and maybe they'll go away before I get there. Like there's just this like, who's here? I don't know who they are. This is an alarm moment. And it used to be a celebratory thing, right? I remember just the sound of somebody knocking on the door was always exciting. And now it's like, what's up? What do I need to do?
Yeah, because Amazon stopped knocking on doors, so it's not them.
It's not them. It's not them. Yeah. And I think also, I don't know, did you see the video? Did you see the video by the comedy guys? I think it was both of them was involved, but it was mostly Jordan Peele did a video kind of in partnership with President Barack Obama, but not really. Did you see this video?
Yes.
It's several years old now, but it's the deep fake technology being used and applied. And so Jordan Peele is making a speech that has been then digitally altered to sound and look like Barack Obama. And so it's been reskinned and it looks pretty convincing. And it's able to be done live. Like that technology can be done with a live video broadcast.
Yep. I think more recently we've seen the more nerdy versions of that with the Star Wars deepfakes that have been corrected by people just on YouTube, right? And have done better than the ones that actually were done by ILM, which funny enough, that guy got hired by ILM because he did a better job than...
Didn't he get a job? He did,
yeah.
Didn't he? Yeah.
Which that's a pretty boss move right there.
But it's taking something that doesn't exist, it's not real, making it look like something you do know that is real so well that you can't even tell it's not real. And which means like there's the ability now, somebody could put you in a video saying something you've never said in a place you've never been, and you won't even be able to tell the difference. Like eventually that will happen, and we may even be there now. We're certainly on the cusp of that being a reality. And so if you can't even tell the difference, how is somebody else supposed to be able to tell the difference? So it's another hit at this idea of trust.
Yep. Reminds me of the I am not a cat judge and lawyer interaction. The guy that the guy that has the filter on in the courtroom Zoom proceedings. Yeah, can't figure out why he looks like a cat. He's confused himself. He doesn't even know it's real.
Right. He's so confused. He doesn't even know that he's not a cat. Of course he does. But yeah. And then did you see that this just dropped? Have you seen the video yet from the Tom Scott YouTube video about the robot?
I saw it pop up on my feed, but I have not watched it yet.
Okay. I did. I watched it yesterday, I think. And I'll probably watch it again at some point to see secondarily how I think about it. But this is a company that is now starting to make 3D in real life humanoid robots, and they have the ability to put a mask on them, paint that so it looks like a real person. And so YouTube star Tom Scott has them make one that looks like him. And it's not great. It's not like it's kind of like digital technology was in probably the early 2000s or something, where like, that's not real, but it looks pretty cool. But
when you're talking better than like the Hall of Presidents in Disney World.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's definitely better than that. Oh yeah. At least the last time I was there, it's better than that. But the thing is, you can tell, like you can see, it doesn't take much foresight to see where that technology is headed. That technology is headed toward the ability to have a humanoid walking around robot that looks like somebody else who actually exists and can talk in a voice that's theirs. And maybe without close inspection, you might think it's that person. This video isn't there yet, but when you look at it and when you watch it, I'd be interested in what you think about just kind of where that technology is clearly headed.
But I mean, point of all this being is that all these technologies only further our skepticism of what's real, what other people's intentions are. And I think it's erosive to culture for sure.
Yeah. So then what does that mean then for friendships, for communications? Like when I get an email, I never used to think that was that email sent by the person who owns the address, right? Like I've been emailing with this person all the time. But recently I got an email from someone who I know very well. We've been doing a lot of email, but the email felt funny. And so I texted him and said, "Hey, is this email from you?" I would never have done something like that several years ago. That would have not been a thing you do. Of course it's from them. But I texted him and said, "Hey, this doesn't fit the pattern of the conversation quite right. Something feels off. Is this email from you?"
Turns out it was from another Somali prince.
And so I wonder about, friendships. I wonder about teamwork. I think teamwork on teams that are in the working relationship, that trust is really foundational to having a good functioning team. And what does the erosion of trust as a tool that we have, the ability to give trust, what does that mean?
Good questions.
Have you ever thought about this? I was thinking about this recently, that there's the idea of trust, and then there's also the word trustworthy. And I think there's a difference between those and how we interact with them.
Why don't you flesh that out a bit for me?
So what I'm thinking about with trust is the action. You place your trust in something.
Okay.
And so you've got to put trust in a person, right? Or in a product or in a review. But trustworthy isn't a measure of my action. It's a measure of the object of trust, and whether or not that object or that person is worthy of the trust. And so if I trust something, this is the fear, right? The fear is that I'm going to trust something that's untrustworthy. And so then I'm going to feel like the promise was broken. But we could go the other way, right? We could choose not to trust something that really would have been good for us because it was trustworthy. And that's the game, or the challenge, right? Is trying to line up putting trust in something that is trustworthy and not putting something in something that isn't trustworthy.
I'm picturing one of those quad charts in my mind right now, but that's probably because I'm an engineer.
That's probably a really good way of visualizing it, I would think. And I think that means one, we should look to figure out how to know if something's trustworthy or not. But then also we should seek to be trustworthy. If somebody's placing trust in you, you would want to be worthy of that trust. But that's all you can control. Like, I can't control if you choose to trust me or not. Tim, you can choose not to trust me, and I can't control that choice. I can control whether I'm trustworthy to the things that you've placed your trust in me for, or even the things you've chosen not to trust me about. I can still try to be trustworthy to something that you haven't chosen yet to do.
Sure.
Right? Because that's about me. It's about my character.
Yeah. Character, virtue, all those things.
Yeah. So I think that might help, is if more people spend energy trying to be trustworthy. And then if we also spend effort trying to identify what is trustworthy, I think that would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah. And so scripture talks about us being discerning. Proverbs is all about us being discerning and knowing what to trust in. I mean, the famous verse out of Proverbs, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, right? Like that is like the quintessential verse on trust.
Yeah.
So if that's going to be the definition of where, or the gold standard rather, of where and what trust should look like, I think the Lord cares about what we trust and who we trust and what we trust in, right? Obviously, first and foremost, that needs to be him. But I think the Holy Spirit will provide us with wisdom and guidance when we allow him to speak into our lives on these issues, on what else we should trust and what else we should listen to and believe in.
And I think it's safe to place all your heart's trust in the Lord. It's safe because he's trustworthy.
Yes.
That verse is one of the very first ones I ever memorized as a kid. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Memorized it as a kid. And in fact, as a school project, like in middle school or something, I had to learn that entire verse, or I guess I chose to, but it was a school thing. Like I could do like a show and tell thing. I learned that entire verse in American Sign Language. I don't know it.
Cool.
I don't know it anymore, but I just remember learning it. And then for like a school talent show thing, like I performed it in sign language, which is, really a pretty boring show and tell, because no one there else spoke any or understood any American Sign Language. And it's not like a very loud, interactive thing, right? So I don't.
For those of you just joining Michael DeGroat and his personality, this tells you all you need to know.
Yep. I still burned in my memory is performing that at a kind of community talent show. And now in hindsight, I realized that was pretty boring television there. That was not good.
So alongside my scripture reading in the mornings, I'm doing my quiet times. I'm reading through the book Life Together. It's my first time going through a Bonhoffer book. But interestingly enough, when you texted me the other day about, I was talking about trust, this quote popped up this morning as I was reading, and I felt like it was kind of appropriate and thought would fit into our conversation this evening. But Bonhoeffer is talking essentially about the definition of what Christian life with other believers should look like, and basing that on other scriptures and things. But he brings up this topic of trust, mainly in relationship to pastors and ministers and those types of people who are, in the professional sense, leaders in the church.
Oh, so people that have like influence or authority in a congregation or a body of believers.
Yes, but I'll read it in that context, but I think it also applies to other contexts we can talk about in a minute. But let me just read the quote and we can dissect it. It says, "The question of trust, which is so closely related to that of authority, is determined by the faithfulness in which a man serves Jesus Christ, never by the extraordinary talents which he possesses." So Bonhoeffer is thick, right?
Yeah.
So
in classic Bonhoeffer form, I'm going to have to chew on this. So help unpack this for me. And by the way, on this episode, we're going to pronounce it Bonhoeffer. Is that the plan?
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
Yes,
okay.
Because I've never met anyone until you dropped that in the other podcast episode of Bonhoeffer. I've never heard that before.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
I'm gonna have to get with my German-speaking cousin on that one and see which is the correct pronunciation.
Okay.
We'll get back to you in a different episode.
The saga continues.
Yes. No, but so obviously he was not from the States. I say that obviously. Bonhoeffer was not from the States. Was German, and this book was written in German and then translated to English. So a lot of this can sound clunky because the translation, I'm sure it's a very faithful translation, but is, like reading a BMW manual at times.
German is hard.
Yes, and very precise. I really like German.
Mm.
Anyway, we digress. So I think what he's saying here, and we've talked about this in different podcast episodes too, of it's very easy to build trust based on things that are near and dear to men's hearts, right? So you have pastors, let's just throw like Mark Driscoll's name out, right? Who had a lot of charisma, had a very large following. But it was based, as Bonhoeffer says here, on his extraordinary talents. Not
like his ability to communicate well, his charisma on stage, his energy. Okay.
Yes. Not, as Bonhoeffer, says here, as determined by his faithfulness in which he serves Jesus Christ, right? So, how does this apply to those of us who aren't in a paid liturgical role, right? Like, how do we break this down for us?
So the quote is, "The question of trust, which is so closely related to that of authority," which makes sense because he's talking about in a church leadership role. So it's closely related to authority. But I still think that there's a connection in authority. You tend to have trust in some type of trustworthiness has a connection to authority. Is determined by the faithfulness with which a man serves Jesus Christ, never by the extraordinary talents which he possesses. Well, yeah, I think this fits the idea of trust versus trustworthy, which we were talking about a moment ago, right? The goal is to seek out what is and who is trustworthy, and knowing the right questions to ask or the right signs to look for. And too often in people, in leaders that we follow, I think too often we identify things as signs of trustworthiness that aren't, like well-spoken, outgoing, tall, right? I mean, you and I are both tall, but there's this whole like science behind being tall has an additional command of respect, it seems, in culture. It gives people an increased chance of being trusted. But
I have in unnecessary measure.
You do. And it's stupid. You're not more trustworthy because you're tall. It has nothing to do with the content of your character at all, right?
I mean, we see this in the story of, of Samuel, right? Going to Jesse.
Yes.
And all of his sons are lined up except for the short and squatty one. That's the youngest. And obviously we know how that story ends, but we choose so many wrong things to put our trust in other people.
Yes. I mean, that's why they chose before David. That's why they chose King Saul. He was chosen partially because he was handsome and he was tall. And he stood above the crowd. And so they chose him because they said, we trust this guy. And that kind of worked out for Israel. Saul was mostly a good king most of the time, but didn't end well for him. And it's the wrong set of things to be looking at to measure trustworthiness. But that doesn't mean this is easy. I think this is really hard. So if you can't look at the easy outward things, and this is where God says he doesn't look at the outward appearance, but he looks at the heart. That's where that verse comes from, right? Is this conversation around David. But how do we do that? And that's not easy. It's not easy, but identifying what is trustworthy seems to be really important.
I mean, just look at, let's just look at pastors, right? So let's say you're having to choose, you show up to a new town, you've got to choose a church that you want to attend, right?
Sure, I've done that before.
On the one hand, you have, let's just say you have two options to make this analogy easy. On the one hand, you have a, church mega pastor who is, or mega church pastor who is, leading 10,000 congregants, is really funny, very charming personality up on stage, maybe some questionable ethics. On the other hand, you have a small town pastor who is maybe got 50 people in his congregation that is extremely faithful, preaches the word faithfully. I mean, that's not necessarily a cut and dry choice, right? And I think the majority of where those people have chosen to put their butts in churches on Sunday mornings would tell you that most people are trusting that church with the larger congregation, right? Like, that's pretty simple and straightforward logic, right?
Well, I think that's one of the elements of trust is it's easier, and this can be a trap. This is where the lemming effect comes in, right? It is easier to trust someone that someone else around you is trusting.
Right.
Right. If there's a whole bunch of people.
For the record, I'm not saying that, all mega church pastors are of questionable repute.
I didn't think that's what you were saying at all. But when lots of people trust someone, it's easier to join in, right? Yes. That's the whole purpose of endorsements. That's why celebrities do commercials and they get paid a lot to do it, to say these are the best shoes, or this is the best back pain medicine, or this is the best hat, right? Because people trust them. And so they can sell essentially some of their trust to a company by endorsing a product.
So what I take from this quote is, as we seek to be men who are leaders, we should first and foremost, the Matthew 6 passage, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. I think it's far too easy for us to be caught up in things that matter to our culture and matter to our society, and be less concerned with things that matter first and foremost to the Lord. So as we seek to be leaders and strive to follow after the Lord in those things, I think it's just a good reminder to pay attention to the Lord and what he tells us in his word for what's important to him, and seek after those things.
That's a good idea. I think, so we can seek to be increasingly trustworthy, right? And doing that by seeking after the Lord, putting him first. I think also it'd be good for us to seek to be trusting. I have chosen for myself that I want to be a person who lives life tending toward trust. I think good things come from relationships when they're built on trust and they can move forward, things can happen. And so I have decided I want to intentionally be less skeptical, less cynical. And I know that means I am more susceptible to occasional misplacements of trust, that on occasion, I will now more often place my trust in something that it shouldn't have, because it's not going to hold up. And that comes from mostly relationships with other people, like peer-to-peer team weight relationships. I want to choose to be more trusting in those cases. And I know occasionally that's going to bite me, but I think it's going to be better off more often. And it's also going to mean that I'm going to live less cynically. And I really want to intentionally choose to do that. And so I put effort into assuming the best possible choice and motivation. So when I am engaged with somebody and something happens and they do something that I don't like or hurts me, I put intentional mental effort into trying to assume the best, giving them all the benefit of the doubt. And that's hard, but I try to create scenarios that say, hey, that person did this with good intentions. I must just not know the full story. They didn't intentionally hurt me. Something happened, something came up, something was missed. I misunderstood them. So I try to start there. And I think that's better. I think that lubricates relationships better when there's a quicker trust. And I want to help be part of that by trusting quickly. And I also think people trust people who trust them back. And so I'm hoping that by showing trust where I can, when I can, that will build trust in the relationship.
Sure. I think that's especially true among a community of believers, right? Like maybe baby steps to start that process, right? Is, start within your circle, right? Angela and I help lead a marriage class at church from time to time. And one of the things that
you told me about that before.
Yeah. It's called Reengage. So just side pitch for this one. If your marriage is in need of help, look up reengage.org. It offers a great biblically based a small group environment for you to go ahead and deal with and wrestle with some of those issues from a great biblical worldview. Anyway, all that to say, one of the things that we help teach in that class is that giving your spouse the benefit of the doubt. It's often easier to do that outside of that spousal relationship, right? Because we just have different parameters for that relationship for whatever reason than we do of other people. We don't have the same expectations of other people that we do of our spouse. And offering your spouse the benefit of the doubt for the actions. So if you come home and things aren't the way you expected them to be, give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they had a hard day or busy day, something popped up that they weren't expecting. So rather than coming home and demanding your expectations be met, take a moment and pause and just assume that something popped up that prevented them from doing what they said they would do or something like that.
I think that's really good. I wonder if you can also use that too, not just with spouses, but also with kids, like to trust your children to help pull them into more of the maturity and the responsibility under Christ that you're wanting to bring them into.
Yep. Yeah, I struggle with this concept. I was joking with a friend of mine recently who's just getting to know me, that my spirit animal is Sam the Eagle, the Muppet character who's very stern.
I can see it right now so well. Yes, it's perfect.
Yeah. Uh-huh. But I mean, it's just kind of my personality. Like I'm not warm and cuddly. And, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that as a kid growing up and even in college, I was pretty naive about a lot of things. So I got burned a lot when I expected people to be trustworthy, and they were not. So I think some level of cynicism has kind of set in my life, and especially with what we talked about earlier in the episode of the military way of thinking and making people earn your trust rather than giving it to them off the bat. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of things that you've given me some things to think about.
Well, that reminds me of, do you remember when we did the episode we did the episode about with Tyler, where we talked about the spiritual growth process with Dr. John Coe.
Mm-hmm.
In that episode, Tyler said something that he kind of said it in passing, but I just realized he talked about Adam and Eve's response in the garden to after they'd sinned. The first thing they did is they cover up, then they hide, and when God shows up, they blame. So those are things we still continue to do when we're faced with sin. We try to cover ourselves, we try to hide from God, and we try to blame others. And he said, and Tyler said something. He said, I wonder what would have happened if instead Adam and Eve had, the moment they'd sinned, if they had sought out God and they'd run to him and said, we messed up, we did a bad thing. What would that have meant? And we don't know that story. That's not how the story happened. So we don't know. That's not how the world unfolded. But what would have happened? And the reason they didn't do that, they didn't trust. They did not put their trust in God in that moment. And that's what we're called to do with our sin even today, is put our trust in God about that. And they didn't trust him. That's why they hid from him. That's why they ran away. And he's the most trustworthy. They should have trusted him. But that's part of the human condition, is that trust is hard for us. And we're not good at it.
Yeah, I really don't struggle with that at all in any sense of the word. I find it very easy to trust God in those times in my life.
I'm going to laugh at you even if
yes.
you don't want me to.
No, I mean, that's hard for us today. It's hard for me today to be completely trusting of the Lord and be completely trusting of the people that God calls us to confess our sins to, right? Like that's something that should be an active part of our lives. And I've been around the faith long enough to know that's something that's expected of me, but it's still very difficult to do that.
Yeah, Tim, thank you. I knew that I was going to enjoy this conversation with you, and I've been wanting to have it for a little while. So thank you. I didn't anticipate some of the insights you were going to bring into it. The Bonhoffer quote was fantastic, and the "I'm not a cat" reference was on point. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Michael, thank you. I mean, I really did enjoy that conversation as well. And like I said, you did give me some things to think about, and I enjoy the way that our friendship has persisted over the last decade plus, and that we've been able to challenge each other in areas like this, and that also we've been able to grow in our trust in one another too. That's been a pretty cool thing. So
yeah, I really value the trust that we have. The trust you have in me means a lot, and the ability to put trust in you is great. So thank you for that. You're a great friend, and I enjoy being able to trust you.
Well, thanks. Hopefully we get to expand that trust over the next 30 years of our annual men's trips that we'll start this year.
Right. Yes. We got to do our fishing trip to Alaska or whatever it's going to be.
A reminder, if you've got, an actual game plan that's been working for you, we'd love to hear about that. So anyway, thanks for joining us on the Ironcenturion Podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Ironcenturion Podcast. We're thankful for the support of listeners like you who support this podcast through donations. If you'd like to be a part of our support team, check us out on patreon.com or ironcenturion.org. For more information on what it means to be a leader for Christ or how you can get involved, visit ironcenturion.org.